Yeah.
Right.
All right. Thanks every. Ooh, we're getting weird.
Just make sure your microphone is turned off and your volume is all the way down.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. I'd like to thank all of you for coming here today. Welcome to the Jordan Center. It is a great pleasure to welcome my old friend Tim Fry. I think we must have met many years ago, but going on 30 years ago at this point. And he's and Tim's going to talk to us today about well, about politicians and subverting elections.
Here we go.
Go on in. You got more.
Go.
Anyway,
You can
fantastic.
flag the book.
Ah, the book. We've got the book here. He's going to be talking to us about his new book, Workplace Politics: How Politicians and Employers Subvert Elections. That's written with John Reuter and David Sacconi, who many of you in the room also know. Tim is the Marshall D. Schulman Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy at Columbia University. He received a BA from Middlebury College and a PhD in political science from Columbia University. He's written 5 books on politics and economics, including most recently the book he'll be presenting on tonight. He's now a member of the Scholars Council of the United States Library of Congress and recently stepped down as editor of Post-Soviet Affairs after serving for 10 years in that position. Hard to believe that has come to yeah. No, I mean there was a very peaceful transition.
That's right.
I talked to her and everything looks like it's going well. A current research project examines public opinion in autocratic Russia with a focus on support for the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. And a second project with Jordan Gansmores and Alexandra Kuidel studies the factors driving Ukrainians' willingness to comply with state tax, judicial, and mobilization policies. But today he's going to present on the book. And we have a small audience in person. I don't know how many people we have online. Are you willing to take questions during the
Absolutely,
talk?
yeah.
So let's
absolutely.
take advantage
People
of the smaller numbers, and we'll and definitely questions. And if people online have questions, we can just raise.
Yeah, I'll let
okay.
do
All right.
that.
So take it away, Tim. It's
Thanks
such a
very
pleasure
much.
to have you here at the Jordan
Yeah,
Center.
thanks very much for the invite. I really appreciate everybody coming out and sharing thoughts about workplace politics, how politicians and employers subvert elections. These are my 2 co-authors, 2 good-looking guys. Consider if you were a worker at a steel plant in the Urals in the 2018 election, you would have gotten a flyer that looks a lot like this. And what it says is, on election day, you need to get dressed, grab your passport, go to the polling place, make your choice and vote. Then call your boss, and here's the number, and then you can go party, right? So Homer Simpson makes it into a Russian election. Here's another text that you might have gotten if you were a worker at the Seamaland Mall in Sverdlovsk. And it basically says, guys, this is important. Everyone must vote. This is mandatory. Our turnout will be reviewed, and I'm afraid to think of the consequences. Vote for who you want. The most important thing is to vote. Right? If you worked at a so-called cracker plant that develops liquefied natural gas in Pennsylvania in 2020, you would have been asked politely by your management to show up for this visit by Donald Trump. You would have had to wait for 5 hours before he actually spoke for security purposes. And if you didn't scan in prior to this event, you decide to skip it, then you wouldn't be paid for the day. Perfectly legal in the United States. And if you drive or take the train north from New York City and get to Schenectady, you'll see this sticker factory with a big sign on the top that says "Vote for Trump." Right? So these are all examples of the topic that we study, workplace mobilization. In the book, we look at the conditions under which it happens and whether or not it's undemocratic. So the last discussion is a more normative discussion of the treatment. And the genesis of the project was in 2011. John and David and I were working at a research center at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. And we did a survey and we asked about workplace mobilization. And we found out that about 25% of all voters in Russia felt some pressure from their employers to go vote. Right? We thought, is that a big number? Is that a small number? We don't really know. Right? We didn't have really any comparative kind of evidence. So we got a grant from National Science Foundation, rest in peace, And we then decided to do surveys in other countries to try to figure out how often this happens. And we also did a deep dive over the next 6 or 8 years on Russia. So we have administrative data, subnational analysis data. We have crowdsourced data about election violations. We did multiple surveys, some of employers and some of employees, because they have different incentives to report on this particular topic. And we did focus groups. The focus groups, I'll quote from some of them today, and those were really like little nuggets of gold. Okay. So this is what we asked in each of the 9 countries where we did surveys. We asked employees whether they experienced any of the following 6 items. And what we found was that in workplace mobilization was very common, right? About 20 to 50%, depending on the country and the election, of employed respondents in the countries that we studied experienced at least one of these forms of workplace mobilization. We think this is a pretty big number. It's much bigger, for example, than say vote buying. You know, we have stacks of books on vote buying, but this seems to be a mobilizational tactic that is more common, particularly in middle income countries where it's just too expensive to buy lots of votes. Here's some more fine-grained data from 6 of the countries: Argentina, Indonesia, Nigeria, Turkey, Ukraine, and Venezuela. You'll see that some of these are perhaps kind of acceptable from the perspective of democratic theory. It might be okay for an employer to talk about an election with your employees, although we'll talk about whether or not even that might be seen as coercive by some employees. Whether or not they endorsed a party candidate, whether or not they held a rally, and whether or not they were asked to vote. So, yeah.
Does the normative implications of these things differ if you are in a country that has mandatory voting? I think Argentina been
yes, but the fines are very small, and
but I mean, like, couldn't you imagine a situation where if you have mandatory voting, like the workplace might be like, we will help you fulfill your civic duty by working with you and you know, to give. I mean, I didn't feel like, you know, if you get things like you can get time off to go vote on election.
We'll get to the normative stuff later. Okay. But even in most countries where you have kind of mandatory voting, you know, the fines are small, and you know, it's not as kind of it's not kind of as onerous as some of the heavy sanctions that you might get from your employer.
But you guys are starting from the perspective that like this is normatively troubling when employers are doing
we have 2 conditions under which we think it's perfectly fine.
Okay.
And then, but those, unfortunately, those conditions are kind of hard to meet. That's what we'll get to.
Okay.
And that's where talking about the U.S. case is really important, right? I mean, in the Russia case, you know, as we'll see, you know, the threats are pretty clear and obvious. The much more subtle cases that are more interesting from a normative perspective are from cases like the U.S., where the Supreme Court with Citizens United has changed the way it deals with this issue, and you know, sided with the argument that you really don't want to restrict political speech in the workplace, and many of these kinds of activities are perfectly legitimate political speech, whereas prior to Citizens United, they had generally been seen as coercive given the generally hierarchical relationship between employer and employee. Okay. We also looked at the case of Russia. These are 3 employee surveys, and we find that around 1/3 of respondents in any given election responded to at least one of these different measures. If we look at crowdsourced data from the vote monitoring agency Golis, we find that the most common form of violation is intimidation by an employer, right? And among the share of all kind of brokered violations, employers are much more likely to be reported to be violating election norms compared to party activists, university officials, school officials, or government officials. So this seems to be fairly common. Interestingly, the share of vote buying, the tactics that are used by employees and party activists are quite different, right? So the party activists tend to use vote buying, whereas employers tend to use much more coercive methods because they just have much greater sanctions in the Russia case. Okay. Here is another, this is a nice telegram to give you some idea of the level of detail here. This is a telex to a boat that's out at sea, where they're being warned that they should get 85% of, not less than 85% of the vote of the participants should be voting, and if they don't, that there's going to be trouble. Here is also how it's organized. This is from the probably largest steel company in Russia in 2011. And here, it starts off with, the kind of basic level on the workshop floor. It goes up to the floor boss, to the managers, to the head of the particular unit, all the way up to headquarters. So this is really well organized in some cases.
Are these all examples of state-owned enterprises, or
no? And in a minute, I'll show you the difference between state-owned and private. We'll see that it's much more common in state enterprises in all the countries that we study, except for the U.S., where the civil service laws make it, for the moment, much less likely to happen than in the private sector, and in Turkey, where turnout rates are really high. And there's a nuance in the Turkish case, but that's true across all cases. But it's the percentage of private firms that engage in this is large enough that it's not a trivial matter. Okay. Good. So here's the U.S. case. We did surveys in 2018 and 2020 online, and we found that about 1 in 2 employees was ever exposed to some form of workplace mobilization, and 1 in 5 were asked to vote for a particular party or candidate. And these are in line with research by Alex Hertel-Fernandez, who wrote a whole book on the U.S. case. And one of the troubling aspects in the U.S. case is that it tends to be the most marginal workers who are most likely to face these kinds of threats. So if this were something that was done as part of the collective good, and we wanted to get everybody out to vote, we wouldn't see this kind of bias. But Alex finds that in his work, and we find that in ours. So what makes this kind of interesting from a political science perspective is that voters also really disapprove of workplace mobilization, even seemingly innocuous forms, right? Even the boss sending an email reminding people to vote, people tend not to like that. And also, people dislike workplace mobilization more than vote buying, seen as more,
So should I think about it as specifically boss mobilizing votes, or is it fierce? I mean, you have 2 stickers that, mobilize voting when you're on your laptop, right? And all of my colleagues also wear them.
Yes.
It does feel like there's a lot of pressure to turn out in elections in the universities in the United States, but I don't think about that as a workplace mobilization, because it's not like the boss. So how should
I mean, the workplace relationship is hierarchical, right? Whereas, having my sticker is really horizontal in a way that I can't fire you for not showing up.
In the context of this research, I should think about it as a sort of my employer directly.
Yes.
And you think this is what your surveys are capturing?
Yes, because we survey both employers and employees, because they have particularly on the normative implications of this. The boss might say, look, I'm not doing anything wrong here, I'm just sending an email. The worker might see this and go, yeah, maybe he's really just interested in getting me out to vote. But I know who he is. I know who he wants to vote for. And
more specifically, when you report these rates at 1 and 2, right? 1 and 5, like, is this should our understanding be that 1 out of 2 people, when they say that they feel like there is workplace mobilization,
That they've
That
ever
they mean-
experienced themselves, yeah.
right, but
Yeah.
do they mean by their peers or do they mean by their bosses? So
No, it was specifically by your employer.
Okay, got
Yeah,
it.
it's
That's what I
not,
wanted.
like, there's a whole nother really interesting literature about like conversations that take place at work. Because work is one of the few places where, outside of academia, where you're forced to deal with people who have very different political views than you. Most workplaces, your political points of view are not very important determinant of whether or not you get that job. So there's often more political diversity in the workplace than there is in, say, your church or your social groups. So there's a really interesting literature on that, but we don't talk about that. We also don't talk about unions mobilizing. Unions can mobilize coercively, but there's a lot of work on that already, and we already have enough to deal with. But that's a good point. Another interesting thing is like voters across the political spectrum oppose workplace mobilization. So in the US, Democrats and Republicans, in Venezuela, Argentina, Turkey as well, we don't see that there's any kind of partisan bias with more pro-incumbent voters being more likely to favor this. So it just seems like people don't like to have politics in the workplace in this way. So here's just some raw data from Argentina, Nigeria, Turkey, Russia, Venezuela, where we asked people, do you think it's acceptable for your boss to ask you to vote or to vote for a particular candidate? And particularly voting for a particular candidate is seen as something that they don't like, right? So when we think about the problem that politicians and employers have about getting their own people out to vote, there's an interesting trade-off that we try to explore. One is, employers are particularly well positioned to use negative sanctions to get people out to vote. They can threaten cuts in salary, they can threaten firing, they can threaten moving to shifts that you don't like. They can do all kinds of things to make your life really miserable. At the same time, the median voter, actually workers don't like it either, but you can also risk turning off the median voter. So there is a trade-off here that that we want to try to explore, the conditions under which it makes sense for politicians to engage in this and employers to engage in this as well. So one of the conditions that we look at is just the extent to which politicians have leverage over employers, right? Just one second. Just because if we think back to our prior tables, most firms don't engage in workplace mobilization. It's a minority of firms. And we have a chapter about the incentives that employers have to engage in this. And in the Russian case, they get more state contracts if you engage with it. So firms that are engaged heavily with the state or state-owned or depend on the state are particularly likely to engage in this.
Yeah, that was the question. That was what I was actually going to ask about on the previous slide when you said that it's likely to turn off the median voter.
Yeah.
If your goal is just to get turnout levels up to a certain point, why do you care if you turn off the median voter? Is the fear that they're going to, like, you're somehow going to convince people who were going to vote not to vote? Is it a concern that once they get into the ballot box, they're going to vote for the other candidate?
Both of those things.
Okay.
And there's a paper that looks at the Russia case. It's not our paper, it's someone else's paper that looks at the size of the firms and the distance to the polling place. And one of the things they show is the closer these big state firms are, or big firms are to the polling place, the higher is turnout, but also the higher is vote for the opposition. So like that's consistent with this story, but there's a lot of there's not individual level data, there's all kinds of ecological inference concerns, but it is consistent with this kind of story that you can get people to the polls. And sometimes they're really concerned with turnout as much as getting a vote for the incumbent party. The other thing is asset immobile firms tend to be more likely to engage in this. And this is kind of interesting because, there's a long literature that firms that have low asset mobility are more likely to oppose the extension of the vote or to oppose democratization because of the fear that the poor will soak them via taxation. Right? Long literature on how kind of this fear of being soaked by the poor keeps wealthy factory owners from supporting democratization. We find that this relationship holds, but we have a different story about it, in which if you're a holder of an immobile asset, you're also more vulnerable to pressure from the autocrat, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that later. We also look at when employers have leverage over employees. So slack labor markets, threats to fire, make workplace mobilization a more attractive strategy. In company towns with low labor mobility. And it might even be that autocrats have an incentive to keep labor markets rigid because they have political benefits that you don't get from more fluid labor markets, and also among state sector employees. And we'll show that these things are true. But then we also show, and here it's a little bit more tricky, we also show that in poor informational environments, right, where there's less press freedom, and the median voter is more likely to find out that you've engaged in this normatively unattractive tactic, that this is less likely. So I can start off with the anecdote that starts off our book is about a factory in the Far East in the Amur Republic, where the workers received a flyer telling them that the factory was going to celebrate a day of health and that they should all show up on Sunday the 18th, which happened to be the day of the election. And they should, that there would be food, but no drink, and that they would have to bring their passport and they would arrange voting, right? And the guy who owned the factory, his last name is Sarapkin, he was running for office, so they didn't have to tell people who to vote for. So one of the workers took a snapshot of this flyer and put it up on the internet. And it was only up for like about 45 minutes. And a local journalist saw it and wrote a story about it. And immediately the factory, issued a statement saying, this is all a hoax. This is all a provocation. We would never engage in this kind of attitude. And when we found out who actually did this, we're really going to be angry, right? So this kind of anecdote, I think, kind of captures the sense that yes, we want to get our people out to vote, but we don't want people to know that we're doing this. Okay, so if we look at what sectors are especially likely to engage in this activity, kind of heavy industry, immobile assets, forestry, lesser so as we go down to trade and services and construction, electricity, other kinds of sectors. Also, if we look at federal government, this is the most likely. Regional and local governments are, more than a third. Military and police around a quarter, but private enterprise in 2011 was around 20%, and in 2016 it was 10%, but that was an election where mobilization was really low. There wasn't a huge emphasis on getting out the vote the way there was in the 2011 and the 2018 election. Okay, and here's some results from predicted probabilities of the types of firms that are most likely to engage in workplace mobilization. So here's the predicted probability going from 0 to 100 of being mobilized if you're in a firm with less than 10 employees versus in a firm in more than 600. This is about 40% probability. This is if you get benefits from your workplace that are beyond your salary, which is another tool that employers could withhold to get people to turn out. And we find, again, that we get a boost there. This is heavy industry versus other sectors. This is whether or not your firm sells, a significant portion of your output to the state. This is for firms that don't, and this is for firms that do. So we see a big jump. This is state-owned enterprise. This is private enterprises. This is state-owned enterprises. And then this is whether you have supplemental benefits beyond your salary. I think that's what that is. So we see the kind of usual predictors that you would expect to see predicting the likelihood of being mobilized. And a lot of it is around the workplace threats. So here's, I want to read one quote. This is from one of our focus groups. This is the kind of quality content you'll get if you buy the book. So this is the moderator. I'm simply trying to understand, do you want to vote because management asks you to, or do you vote because they tell you there will be negative consequences if you don't? Well, they hint at it. Tell me what they say. Well, they say that you have to fill your duty as a citizen. They always say that you are obliged to do it. And what comes to mind if you decided not to vote after all? Maybe I would lose my bonus or something else. How could we know? So they don't specifically say what would happen if you don't vote. No. You assume something would happen, we can imagine it ourselves. There's a bunch of them like that. So here is another kind of simulation that we ran, which is the probability of workplace mobilization using all of the predictors that we identified earlier, all the demographic characteristics, the characteristics of the sector, characteristics of the firm, but we also looked at regions in which press freedom in Russia was characterized as low, medium, and high. And what we see is that in the regions where press freedom was lower, we see that the likelihood of being mobilized is higher than in the regions where press freedom was higher. So we take this as kind of consistent with the story that employers are wary of engaging in workplace mobilization if the larger community is likely to find out about it. And if we look at party-based mobilization, it's not only a lot lower, it's not really conditional on the level of press freedom. And this accords with the view that people have no problem with party-based mobilization, but they have a normative distaste for kind of workplace mobilization. Okay. Finally, we looked at some survey-based experiments where we gave respondents information about the mobilization tactics that different candidates used. So we asked all respondents in Russia, I think this was in 2018, let's say that in the next electoral campaign, your governor promises to increase spending on roads, hospitals, and schools. In addition, he promises to increase employment in the region. And then we said, in addition, imagine that you also learned that he had put pressure on state sector workers to vote if he was in the state sector, put pressure on employers, encouraged party activists to buy votes, held a TV debate with an opponent, or we didn't give them any kind of information. So here we're looking at people's willingness to vote for a hypothetical candidate, conditional on whether they were told that the candidate engaged in these different kinds of mobilization strategies. Okay, and what we see is that just in broadest terms, voters punished candidates for governor who pressured bureaucrats or pressured employees to get out to vote. They also did so for candidates who said that they were willing to buy votes, but by not so much. This is kind of a placebo, or I had hoped that being willing to debate your opponent would have been a good thing but it doesn't seem to have any effect on voting. And then this is kind of interesting when we split the sample. So this is the mean responses that I just showed you for all respondents. But we can also split the respondents into those who were strong supporters of United Russia and those who were weaker supporters of United Russia. And one of the interesting things we see is that if anything, it's the stronger the stronger supporters of United Russia who are more likely to punish a candidate for violating this democratic norm. And one notion is that this might be kind of newer information for high United Russia supporters who don't think that their candidates have to engage in this kind of activity. That's one possible explanation. But we see it across all three of these violations of democratic norms. We see it as well with vote buying as well, that again, it's the stronger United Russia supporters who are more likely to object than the weaker United Russia supporters. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about whether it's bad. Is workplace mobilization bad? Right? So on the one hand, we might think that it's really good for employers to talk with their employees about politics, because the employers tend to have information about the state of the market, about the future of the firm that employees don't have. So if they're able to talk with them about this and convince them that their fates are going to be influenced by whether or not they give money to candidates, whether or not they protest, whether or not they go vote, that this would be a good thing, right? Also, as I mentioned before, work is a good place where people often do talk about politics, and often talk about politics across party lines. Also, there might be cases where the interests of the employers and the employees line up. So if you're facing foreign competition, then it could be that the employer can take what the employee can take what the employer says about the interests of the firm at face value because they have a common enemy. Also, if we think about the problems of low turnout in a country like the United States, the problem of uninformed voters, maybe workplace mobilization is a good thing. However, we also tend to put voter autonomy, the ability to vote as one would like without suffering consequences, really high on the concerns about democracy, right? Moreover, we think that kind of coercive mobilization is always bad, and that coercion is generally in the eye of the beholder, right? So it's it really depends on how people perceive the ask from their employer as coercive or not, rather than trying to judge that objectively. I gave this speech once, and Jane Mansbridge, who's like one of my favorite democratic theorists, her view was like, a little bit of coercion isn't so bad. From a democratic perspective, if you look at the aggregate level, given low turnout, maybe a little coercion might help to balance the playing field a little bit if, people know that they can vote their conscience. So, which, I think that's her argument would be more persuasive if you could use coercion to get people to vote, but then convince them that whatever their choice was, they were good. Okay. Also, well, we tend to think that people should not be compelled to hear speech. I don't know. Did you corral anybody, put pressure anybody to come to this talk today? This would be a violation, I think, of kind of democratic norms. We think that people should be able to, listen to speech if they want to, according to their own volition. And workers are definitely a captive audience, right? So if the boss says, you have to go to political meetings or you won't be paid, or it's your job to make phone calls on behalf of a political candidate, we're changing your job title. All of a sudden, you have to collect signatures now for a particular candidate. And this is particularly a concern if these kinds of threats are made against more vulnerable groups rather than made generally. Yeah.
So, so the particular candidate part of it, I think, is like not debatable, right? With the exception of like providing information that's like, if there's one candidate out there that says they will close the firm, one candidate that will provide subsidies, maybe you could argue that that's something there. But on this point number 3 about being right not to vote or be compelled to hear speech.
Yeah.
So NYU ran an NYU Votes program in the last election.
Good.
Where they put posters up, made lots of emails out to students saying that, and made it easier for people to register to vote.
Yeah.
Is that violating the being compelled to hear speech?
So
part of it?
That is this is kind of less of a concern.
Okay.
Like I'm going to get to the conditions in just a second that we think are important.
All right, I'll hold
if
on.
you just hold up for just 1 second.
Okay.
But also like the right not to vote, like that's also something that we might put some normative value on. And again, this is different from mandatory voting where it's applied to everybody. Like if only some workplaces are mobilizing their people, that's different than if it's a requirement that everybody has to engage in it. Because if it's the case that your kind of political voice is contingent on where you work, that also kind of might tip the scales if we think about, we want to level the playing field so that everyone has an equal chance, an equal incentive to vote. It also might be bad simply because there are efficiency losses. This is not what people want to spend their time doing. So one thing that we did is we asked people in Turkey, how comfortable are you with the contact that you had with your employer in the last election? So this is whether you were comfortable, whether you were indifferent, or whether you were uncomfortable. So crude measures I granted, but you get a general sense here. So even like just being asked to vote, 60% felt uncomfortable just being asked to vote by their boss. Another 20% were indifferent, and only about 20% were comfortable with that. Any kind of vote buying, attending a rally, or voting for a particular candidate, and then even discussing politics. Only about 15% of respondents said yes, they were comfortable discussing politics with their boss. Right? Even distributing material, people tend not to like this. Moreover, lots of kinds of workplace mobilization are coercive. So this is from a list experiment that we did in Turkey, where we asked, how many of the following items happened to you in the last election? Did you see an election campaign? You met a candidate for parliament? You saw a news story about politics? And then the sensitive item, which half the sample received and half the sample didn't, was someone gave you the impression there would be negative consequences for you if you did not vote or did not vote a certain way. So we wanted to capture both pressure to turn out and also pressure to vote for a particular candidate. And we see that in the voter coercion was pretty common. About 22% in Turkey felt that it was intimated to them that they would suffer some negative consequences in some way. And that there was a big difference between people who had experienced workplace mobilization and people who hadn't, right? So this is along with, all of the other evidence that we have about workplace mobilization being coercive. Here's one more quote. This is from Katerina in Zlatoust. The boss gathered us up and the candidate came to us during the day and there was a speech. and the boss said that we had to vote for this or that candidate without question. You were told in no uncertain terms who to vote for. This is the moderator. Yes, they asked us to vote for Weinstein, if I remember correctly. Were you promised anything in exchange for your vote? No, we weren't promised anything. On the contrary, they told us that if we didn't go, then we would lose our bonuses or be punished in some way. Did you believe the threats? Well, everyone values their work now. We all went to vote. They ordered us, and we gathered in line like little geese and went. We decided it's better not to risk it. Okay, good. So when we think about whether workplace mobilization is normatively acceptable, one of the things we look at was whether it's implicitly or explicitly coercive. And as I mentioned before, even subtle reminders can be seen as coercive, right? But in general, a call to remind people that the election is on this day, some neutral statement of the issues and the candidates, like that's if employers want to do that, that seems great. And even some gentle nudges, I don't think are anything we should lose too much sleep about. Employers do have free speech rights, and it's sending an email that says, the firm thinks it's better if you do things this way. That's less bad than having, forcing people to attend a meeting or forcing people to engage in political activity, which is perfectly legal thing to do in the US, right? It's really, though, not acceptable if it's conditional, like if there's some quid pro quo where your actions ex post will be influenced in one way or another by your decision to vote. Also, does it increase political bias? Like, one thing that we're concerned about is that incumbents have a big advantage in engaging in kind of workplace mobilization. If there are some kinds of firms that can engage in this, it can tilt the playing field in ways that are problematic and harder for challengers to meet. So, if workplace mobilization is not coercive, if it's not conditional, and it doesn't increase political bias in a systematic way, then I think it's, can be supportive of democracy. But it's just very difficult to meet these kinds of conditions, particularly outside of a democratic setting where, or in a setting like the US is a little bit tricky because labor laws are so restrictive here or so expansive in the number of ways that people can be fired. The story is you can be fired for a good reason, for a bad reason, or no reason at all in the United States. That does make even mild threats much more exaggerated than in, say, Europe, where worker protections are much greater, and a lot of these kinds of political activities are illegal. So in the US, there's a world pre-2010 when Citizens United was decided, and post-2010. Like prior to 2010, employees were barred from engaging in any kind of campaign activity at work. They couldn't advocate for a specific party, and they could only solicit contributions every quarter, and they had to go to a specific kind of PAC, and there were strict limits on it. But after the Citizens United decision, all of these workplace protections went out the window. And the argument that the Supreme Court made was that if political speech means anything, then we don't want to restrict it. We want to have a really high bar for restricting political speech, even in the workplace. So we have seen, an increase in workplace mobilization in the United States since Citizens United. Okay, so most importantly, why should you read this book? Or actually, more importantly, why should you buy this book? So this is a common but understudied form of electoral subversion. that, we have stacks of books on vote buying, but this seems to be at least as prevalent and in some ways even more normatively concerning. There's really rich and novel data, not just from Russia, but from a host of other kind of important middle income countries that are really the first of its kind. This is a topic that has not been studied in a comparative fashion. And it also has a lot of Russia content. For this crowd, that's especially important. And it also has some implications for how we think about Russia. Why does Russia have weak parties? Well, one reason is that if you can mobilize people through the workplace, that the workplace can substitute for political mobilization and because it's really hard to create the kinds of deep embedded organizations that allow political parties to mobilize. It's much easier to rely on firms. Also, if we think that this is a normatively problematic practice, we want to have we talk about a number of strategies for reducing it. Okay, thinking outside of Russia, it suggests that this kinds of political clientelism can persist even in urban industrial settings. And in some ways, we think that there might be some kind of like Kuznets curve of workplace mobilization. So in pre-industrial societies, you don't have very much of this. In kind of industrial societies that rely on large, heavy industry manufacturing plants, this kind of activity might be particularly likely. But as countries kind of exit the industrial economy and move to a more knowledge-based economy, where workplace mobilization is harder to organize, firms are smaller, assets are more mobile, we might see this kind of electoral subversion becoming less attractive. Also, it gives us some reasons why democratization and economic structure might be related, and why autocrats or would-be autocrats might like restrictive labor markets and big state firms because they have this political benefit. And we also identify the separate path by which holders of immobile assets might be advocates of autocracy that works not through their expectations about being taxed, but by being more vulnerable to pressure from the autocrat. And finally, kind of one way to reduce this is to strengthen the norm against workplace mobilization. Like, one of the downsides of the Citizens United decision is that it weakens the norm that workplace mobilization is bad. And in the United States, now that Democrats and Republicans are both engaging in this strategy, it might weaken the norm that this is bad. And that norm is a really important break on the practice. Okay. Thanks a lot for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. And it's available at all the finance bookstores. Thank you very much. Let's take questions?
Yeah, you want to just take questions yourself?
Yeah, sure.
So
do it.
at least in the context of Russia, and maybe you can also talk about it comparatively. So should we think about the firms as intermediaries? Like, what is sort of the most common incentive structure?
Good. So if we think about the US case, the incentive comes from the owners. Like all of the cases that we've looked at, it's politically motivated, typically on the right, mobilizing their workers, and it's not so much pressure from politicians. In the Russia case, we have a chapter where we look at why would employers engage in this activity. It takes workers away from their work. It's something that the workers don't like, so they need to be incentivized in some way. And one of the things we show is that firms that engage in workplace mobilization receive more state contracts in the post-election period than they do in the pre-election period, or and these benefits come from the regional government, not from the federal government or from the local governments, because most of this is organized through the regional governors. So you do have to incentivize employers in Russia to engage in this activity, and we have some kind of difference in difference evidence that speaks to this. Because it's interesting, like if you ask, like we also did surveys of the employers, and we asked them, you know, why doesn't everybody engage in this? And they're like one of the most common response was, it's just не принято. It's just unacceptable. You know, it's just not. It's problematic. And then they had other things as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a related question.
Yeah.
You just answered some of what I wanted to ask. I'm curious about sort of the connection between politicians and the bosses or the owners
Yeah, yeah.
who are
Oh,
doing
right.
this mobilization,
Uh-huh.
and sort of what that relationship looks like. I'm especially, it's something I imagine would be very different, for instance, in Russia and the US, like the relationship between the
Yeah.
Trump campaign and a factory where he wants to hold an event. But I'm just sort of curious to hear you talk more about how that interaction goes.
So the work that's generally been done on this looks at the employer and the employee relationship, and we wanted to try to also back that up a little bit. And that's why we looked at the kinds of firms that were most likely to engage in this, like state-owned firms, firms with immobile assets, larger firms. And we also have some recordings and some videos of meetings where the regional governors gets the managers together and says, guys, you know what we have to do. You know, we know who to vote for. We know, and you know, you have your targets that you have to hit. And if you want to be in good standing, this is what you need to do, right? And it's pretty, you know, it's pretty well organized. And again, not every firm does this. Most firms don't do this, but large firms, you know, firms where, you know, that are really dependent on the state are just a lot more likely to engage in it. We don't have a good like identification strategy for figuring out, you know, how tight that relationship is. But that's just, we can see from the observational kinds of data. So,
We have a question.
oh,
Yes, okay, looks like
Oh.
we submitted to the, I can't, can you please resend your question, to the general chat if you can hear me? Because we can't, read your question, it's, I have to open it up. Okay.
there's also some sentiment from our focus groups where sometimes the workers feel bad for their bosses because they're like, you know, I know he's on an annual contract. If we don't go vote, he's going to get in trouble from the politicians above him. So, you know, we like him, so, you know, we don't want to cause trouble, so we're just going to go along. So the threat kind of goes all the way through. Yeah. Can Josh channel the voice of Victoria Habibulina?
Yeah, so this is a question about the data source.
Oh, good.
In slide 11, it said the survey, it's slide 11, 3 waves. You mentioned HSE, which is a state university in Russia.
Yes.
And I guess the question here is, how have you controlled for the quality of the collected data in Russia?
Okay.
How do you have proof regarding the scientific character of your conclusions, which do not depend on your workplace at HSE?
Oh,
is there a concern? I
no.
think the gist of this is the concern about data quality because you're sort of cooperating with state institutions in Russia to collect this data.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly in this period, 2011, 2016, 2018, you know, lots of people were doing surveys. These were all done by the Levada Center. Most of these were standalone surveys that we commissioned ourselves, so we controlled like the whole questionnaire. So there shouldn't be, you know, concerns that, you know, our questions were kind of interfering with what other people are doing, or other people's questions were interfering with ours. we had to go through the state procurement process. You know, any as a state entity, which was an experience in itself. One of the surveys, actually, Sion won the bid, and there was nothing we could do about working with Levada Center. So we have one of our surveys that we did that was done by Sion, which is a more kind of Kremlin-friendly firm. And actually, Sion also did a lot of surveys on this topic, independent of us, and the results were all pretty similar. So we also did list experiments to try to see whether or not respondents were unwilling to talk about this. We didn't find, you know, a lot of voter sensitivity on this, in part because this is something that gets reported on in the newspaper. It's not, you know, it's a tradition that goes back to the Soviet period. Although in there's one survey from the 1990s, and there was much less workplace mobilization in Russia in the 1990s than there was in the Putin era. So maybe it is something about its more autocratic nature. But I wouldn't worry too much about data quality here, given that we have multiple survey companies, and we're not discussing the most sensitive things. And when we were discussing sensitive topics, we tried to use some techniques to account for that. But that's always because, and that's actually also why we wanted to do the focus groups, where we could, you know, get people to open up a little bit and get a lot more, you know, nuance as well.
Another question.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll ask one now.
Yeah.
So just following up on Arturus's
Yeah.
point, I'm trying to think through, and I wonder if you guys thought about this, the distinctions in terms of the theoretical predictions here,
Yeah.
based on whether it's like the US version of it, where you're saying it's like the
Yeah.
employer, right? Because
Yeah.
it sounds, if you like take a principal agent framework,
Yeah.
in one story, the employer is the principal, and in one story, the employer is the agent.
Yeah.
And the problem is like the slippage between, it's like a dual thing with a state.
Yeah.
So like how should we think differently about like,
Yeah.
is it the same phenomenon in both cases? Like, do you guys think it's
Yeah.
actually really the same thing going on, or are there all sorts of there are different sets of motivations?
No. So yeah, I think that there are different sets of motivation. In the US case, the owners actually care about policy more so. I mean, in the sense that they care about the outcome of the election, and they're worried that it's going to go the other way. Whereas in, you know, the Russia case, it's more about being on, you know, the being in the good column of the regime. So there's really not, you know, we have a quote from Mitt Romney at a campaign event in 2012 where he says, you know, guys, you should go mobilize your workers. But we don't have lots of evidence of coordination of this. Although, you know, there are like law firms, there's lots of companies that will bundle their campaign contributions. And there we might see some, you know, you might see some coercion. Like one thing I would like to look at in the US case is when law firms, when you go from being a junior a member of the firm to being a partner, like, do then you give differently? Like your campaign donations, are they different? Like if you know you're working at a conservative firm or at a liberal firm, like does reducing that vulnerability then change your campaign strategy? But you know, we don't see a lot of coordination in the US case in the same way that we do like in the Russia case.
So just to follow up on that,
Yeah.
I guess the other thing that I'm kind of curious about, whether there's an important distinction here, is that if you think about, I mean, in general, and it's a provocative talk in that regard. In general, we tend to think about get out the vote campaigns in the US as or in democracies, and especially in democracies where you have low turnout, and especially in democracies where you have differential turnout by socioeconomic status. We tend to think of those as like good for democracy. We can even get away from the normative thing, like that they do a better job that they are designed to increase turnout, and so you end up getting better representation out of the elections of the
Yes.
preferences of the population. The stories that we know about turnout in autocracies is the idea that like the autocratic leader wants to get a certain, and I mean, obviously these are the early Putin stories, right? Like, but that the autocratic leader wants to ensure a certain, or the Saddam Hussein wants to ensure legitimacy by getting turnout and participation above a certain level. And so in those cases, the turnout stories are coercive.
Yeah.
So do we need a kind of different theory of workplace mobilization, or do you want to make the argument that like, no, actually workplace mobilization is workplace mobilization, and it's potentially problematic for like the reasons that you said here, the right not to hear speech, all these kind of things. And so like, is the takeaway from bundling these things together in this book that you shouldn't have get out the vote campaigns that are organized within workplace institutions?
Yeah, I mean, around 20% of the respondents in the US who said that they experienced some form of workplace mobilization said that it involved threats. So in that way, there's a consistency,
right?
And to the extent that it's targeted at more vulnerable workers, more vulnerable sectors, there I think the normative issue comes through in both cases. The others, though, I think are a little bit more problematic. Like in some ways, I'm sympathetic to the Jane Mansbridge point for all the reasons that you pointed out. Like, can we use, mild coercion to level the playing field a little bit and get groups that otherwise wouldn't turn out to vote to the polls? Or do we want to say, no, look, voter autonomy is sacred, and look, they all have the chance to vote. But given how hard we make it to vote here in the United States, maybe her argument makes a little bit more sense here than in other countries where registration is so much easier, voting periods are much longer, and it's just much easier to vote. So,
okay,
yeah.
You want to read them? Okay. All right, here's a different question. This is from Raymond. Compare Russia and Ukraine as two post-Soviet states. Also, how would you characterize Zelensky's visit to an arms factory in Pennsylvania prior to the
very good.
election?
Very good, very good. So we do have some data from Ukraine. We have one survey from I think it's 2012, and we find 20% or so. It's not an uncommon practice. And Jessica Pisano in her book writes a lot about this in a qualitative fashion, showing that a lot of the processes that I'm describing here are present there as well. Of course, the elections in Ukraine are much more competitive, with turnover at the presidential level in every election in a way that we don't see in Russia. So one question is whether the Zelensky visit in Pennsylvania was a mistake, in that it didn't just influence the people at the firm. I think it also caused a fair amount of backlash. Like, is this kosher? Do we want foreign leaders coming to basically rally on behalf of a particular candidate? So I don't know what the net was. Whether that's coercive or not, it's a good question. I mean, it's not as if Zelensky could fire people, I guess. That does make it a little different than if it's somebody who is in a real position to influence the life chances of people who are working at the plant. So that might be one way in which it's more acceptable. Also, there might be more information value. Like, another way to think about these kinds of exchanges is that there's useful information that's passed from the politician to the workers. And I don't imagine that, a lot of workers had well-developed views on, how their vote would affect Ukraine, whereas, Donald Trump visiting the cracker plants, he's going to tell people things that they probably already know. So the information value of that kind of visit also is probably a lot smaller. But that's a really good question.
Anyone else in the room? Anybody on?
Scott?
Oh,
Good,
Scott,
good.
yeah, sorry.
I'm like thinking through the definition of coercion and also a
Okay.
workplace.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking through like the different experiences that I've had with this, right? So there's like people will ask you to register to vote. They
Right.
might just ask you to register to vote. That's it. Maybe they'll tell you who they're with. Maybe not. It depends on the organization that's doing it. In the U.S., that is.
Right.
Sometimes people will ask you to register to vote and also give you literature for the
Good. Yeah.
for the candidate that they're with. So I'm just wondering, like, which of those experiences counts
So-
as coercion, or would they all be considered coercion if they were happening within the context of a workplace? And then thinking
Yeah.
about the definition of a workplace, like talking about NYU, like
Yeah.
as an employee and a student for some period of time, as an employee, I always interpreted these messages as more targeted towards students. And if you're a student, like, is the university a workplace? Maybe this is like getting too much into the
No.
of this.
No, 'cause it's like-
but yeah, what is
Yeah, no, these are all great points. Like in Russia, schools are a common place where
Right.
voter mobilization happens in faculties. Teachers are like very involved in this kind of it's not something that we study. Natalia Farad has done some work.
There
on
was stuff
this.
on like students being threatened with not getting their stipends. If
Yes,
the turnout wasn't high
right.
enough in earlier elections.
That kind of thing. And like one of the things that we want to point out here is like workplace politics. It takes different kinds of forms, and some of them might be more normatively acceptable than others. And what's really important here is this kind of hierarchical relationship where your vote can then become conditional on the pressure from a higher up, like somebody who's in a position of authority mobilizing you is very different from somebody who's not in that same kind of hierarchical relationship. Like prior to the Citizens United, that was the way they viewed the employer-employee relationship as one that was primarily hierarchical, and you needed to take steps to ensure that the workers were not exploited by their bosses, given their difference in power. And then that was weighed against the restrictions on free speech. And then after Citizens United, they decided in favor of free speech rather than worker protections.
Just a follow-up question. So when you were saying that 20% of people in the US said that they felt threatened by workplace politics, how did you define threatened?
So I think we use the term like threats in wages, threats and changes in hours. So we use some specific things. Like, I'm not sure, that might be some expressive responding. That seems like a high number to me.
Yeah.
Although Alex Fertel Fernandez in his much more extensive surveys found, a similar number. So, and they actually, it was 20% in 2018, and the next time in 2020, it was only 9%. It was a lower number. So, a lot of it is going to depend on question wording, on sample size, and all kinds of things. The Russia stuff, we're really pretty confident that we understand what's going on. The other cases are more attempts to kind of plant the flag and say, this is an issue that people should be studying. And we just want to, identify, some broad patterns maybe, that it happens more in the state sector, for example, than in the private sector. And we do some, country level regressions where we do try to tease out some of these patterns, but, we don't have a large enough sample of countries to say anything kind of cross-nationally. So, we encourage people to do that. One thing I would be interested in exploring, though, is whether autocracies have more rigid labor markets. Like would be one cross-national implication of our argument that, we could try to test.
Another question.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions on it.
Okay. So Yeah, so Raymond was actually a follow-up.
Oh, okay.
What if both Democrats and Republicans had escorted Zelensky in the factory? Would that change things?
Yeah, I mean, that would, the second concern we have about it, you know, on making the playing field unlevel, it would address that concern. So yeah, so I'm okay with Zelensky coming and giving a talk, as long as, like, you know, it's not coercive. It is a little troubling, though, in the captive audience sense that you know, workers couldn't avoid this speech. You know, one of the nasty things in the Citizens United is ruling is that, you know, employers can actually compel you to go to meetings and hear speech you don't want to hear, and they can, even if they want, compel you to engage in political activity on behalf of the firm. And that is, you know, employers tend not to do that because it would really anger the entire workforce. But that's legally within their right. You know, for most jobs where, you know, the employer sets the conditions of the employment contract. You know.
We have one other question from online, which is, do you think there are differences and actually I'll bundle this into what I wanted to ask as well, which is like, so the specific question was, and I'm going to bundle it in a more general question. The specific question is, do you think there's differences in perceptions of what is considered coercive cross nationally? And the question that I want to ask, that I'll just sort of like, that kind of fits in nicely with, is, you sort of motivated the talk by saying we as a field have paid way more attention to vote buying than we have to workplace coercion. And then in your most recent answer, you said, like, okay, this is more like flag planting. So after having worked on this project for many years, like, what would you say are the sort of pressing questions that the field, that people who are interested in pushing, like, if you were going to say, okay, so this is now, you know, we did all this stuff on vote buying. Now we need to do stuff on workplace. What are the three most important questions we need to try to answer in that regard? And then potentially, is there a different payoff here? Like, and I think you sort of started to hint at that at the end, where you said, well, maybe this is like, this will tell us something about authoritarian political economy, because it's, so like, what's the payoff that we could get from studying workplace mobilization that we didn't get from studying vote buying?
Good. So one thing is, how do people find out about workplace mobilization taking place? So that in our last surveys, we asked a bunch of questions about whether people learned about it in the press, did they learn about it from their friends, you know, did they hear about it online? So like the information that people have about violations of democratic norms generally, and where they come from, and how they perceive those, I think like that's a really rich area. You know, we're starting to get it in the US with all these conjoint experiments about violations of democratic norms. You know, Canada says they're not going to abide by judicial decisions. You know, we could do a similar thing for workplace mobilization, but also understanding better the information process and how people gather information about this practice. The other thing that is, as I mentioned, is it the case that this is all just endogenous to autocratic strategy, and that they actually design their economies in ways that are less economically efficient, but might allow them to retain some, you know, political benefits, with one implication being that, you know, on average, controlling for everything else, a labor market should be more rigid in autocracies, and we, you know, might be able to tease that out. And then this last question about like what people consider as coercive is a great question that we don't know about. I think we have a good sense, you know, from our sample that, you know, asking people to vote for a particular candidate, that's seen as kind of beyond the pale. You could look at various ways of asking people to vote, like which are seen as more kind of less acceptable and more acceptable. I mean, more generally, Yeah, this is part of a broader research agenda about the nature of voting rights. Like, we used to think like voting rights were these like static things that, you wrote down on paper who was allowed to vote, and then we could, rest at that. But I think like everything we know now is that voting rights are really, contingent on power relationships, on context, on, all of these other kinds of things. They're much more dynamic and negotiable. So trying to understand the conditions under which, voting rights are actually rights that people expect to have, and or they can be compromised by your employer, by a union, by your your social sphere, in ways that might be problematic. I think that's another really interesting path of study to think about. What does this research tell us about voting rights generally? So, great.
All right. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank
This
you
was
so much.
great. I enjoyed this.
Tim would be more than willing to sign books if you brought your.
Yeah, that's right. For all of those who brought multiple copies. But yes, there's lots of good stuff in here. We have like 20 of those plates, with text messages and flyers, and some of them are just great. And then, the focus group materials just, so some of them are just some of those are just great. Like we were going